Falcons' fourth-round rookie Brandon Dorlus has the potential to be the next Grady Jarrett.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And of course, you know me, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka the iron that sharpens the iron, aka Mr. aka, and of course, I've been covering the Falcons for 18 years, an entire lifetime, formerly at falcfans.com. RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I think each and every one of you that is going strong with me. A shout out to the everydayers that make this illustrious show their first listen or first watch of the day. And to become an everydayer, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode is all about Brandon Dorlus. We're finally getting to him about 10 days later than I thought I would when sort of initially planning out and mapping out our sort of summer schedule of tremendous content here on this illustrious podcast. Unfortunately, I went on vacation at the end of May and thought, once I get back from Orlando, I'll get back immediately to the grind of watching film. And I was just like, no, I'm still in vacation mode, but it came to film. And that's why this is coming out as late as it is. But hopefully we'll get back on track. Now, talking about Brandon Dorlus, let's talk about his potential as a pass rusher. And going through the 6 games I watched this past year, he had about 40 pass rush wins across those games, and pretty much an even split, one third of power rushing moves, technical pass rushing moves like swim moves and rip moves, and then 35% was power, 35% was technical, and 30% was other, which is, stunts and cleanup, unblock pressure, things where it's more scheme and circumstance that lead to his wins, not necessarily individual skill. And, when it came to what were his preferred pass rush moves, it was probably a bull rush, rip, swim moves were probably his most effective moves. I did see some, him trying different things like spin moves and ghost moves, especially a year ago when he played more as an edge rusher. He doesn't really have the skill set, I think, to pull off those moves, but it does make me intrigued that he's trying stuff, and that makes me, buy in a little bit more to his pass rush potential if he can sort of apply similar lessons to the interior and be more of that technical pass rusher that can win with his hands and in a variety of moves. But the majority of his pass rush came as a 3-tech. About 48% of those 40 pass rush wins this past year came with him lined up in a 3-technique role. When it talks about scheme fit, Dorlus, I don't love his fit as a defensive end in a 3-4 defense. Like when he was asked to play more of that 4-eye or 5-technique role that is pretty typical of a 3-4 defensive end, he wasn't nearly as effective in that specific role. Being more of a true 3-tech versus an outside guy was when he was most effective. And when 4 out of the 6 wins he had when he was in a 4-eye or 5 technique were, sort of those other, the unblocked, the stunts, those types of things. So he wasn't really consistently winning that way. And when he did play more as an edge rusher role, playing more 6, 7, and 9 technique roles, 6 of the 9 wins that he had in that role were bull rush and power moves. And that sort of is where he's probably going to win as an edge rusher. And that's one of the selling points on Dorlus, is sort of having that inside-outside versatility. But again, I think he's probably ideally more of an interior guy. I think if I was saying, okay, what's the ideal scheme and role that I would envision for Brandon Dorlus coming into the NFL and long-term in the NFL is probably being more of a base defensive end in a 4-man front, right? That he can play in base defense on early downs, run downs, play more of a defensive end role with a hand in the dirt as that 4-3 defensive end. And then on third downs, passing situations, he can kick inside where he can be most effective. And over the last 10 or 15 years, there have been some very prominent names that have played a similar role. Michael Bennett, Malik Jackson, Za'Darius Smith, Justin Tuck sort of play that role. And that's kind of what I can see Dorles being in one of those players. We'll talk about which one is the guy that I compare his ceiling to. So that's the type of player that I think Dorles has the potential to grow into. But we'll talk about that later in the episode when we get to the NFL player comps. But as a true sort of full-time edge rusher, he lacks the bend and burst, I think, to really be that type of guy that basically he's not going to really threaten outside of his bull rush, right? And that's a similar thing that we talked about with Brandon Trice, almost a month ago. That if Dorles was to play at outside linebacker, I think he'd be more of a pressure guy that lacks the sort of high end upside to be a true sack artist in the NFL. I think his upside, as I mentioned earlier, as a pass rusher is primarily as an interior rusher. He's built more like a D tackle. He just looks like a D tackle with that sort of 6'3", 286 pound frame. That's what he weighed in at his pro day. If the Falcons wanted him to be more of an edge rusher, I think they would need to get him to drop down 10 or more pounds to be sub 275, somewhere in that 270 to 275 pound range. I think right now, based off of how he's built and what I think his ideal role, he's probably better served bulking up a little bit and being more in that 290, 295 pound range. And I think that would help him, be a better fit on the interior, but also help him beef up against the run as an interior defensive lineman, where he's not great against the run. Like, he's fine, but he didn't make a ton of plays on the film that I watched as a run defender. He's more of a disruptor than a guy that can, hold the point of attack, especially playing that 4-eye or 5 technique role. I tended to see a lot of instances, too many instances, in my opinion, where he would kind of get bodied against the run, playing specifically that 4-eye 5 tech role, as opposed to elsewhere when he played elsewhere. I think he's best served sort of pinning his ears back and being that penetrating, disruptive player. Didn't see a ton of that at Oregon. Maybe some of that is owed to Oregon's scheme not really asking their players to do that. That does happen at the collegiate level where, I remember Sheldon Rankins played as a 3-4 defensive end at Louisville, a decade ago, and he was basically asked to hold a point of attack. And then he got to the Senior Bowl in the combine and showed this first step quickness that he didn't really get the chance to show at the collegiate level because Louisville didn't ask him to do that. And so for me, when I look at Dorles, he could be better at that. That may be one of the reasons why he didn't make as many plays, because Oregon wasn't really asking him to pin his ears back and get upfield and be that disruptive presence. And so I think there's plenty of room to grow for Dorles as a run defender. But I do think that lack of polish, I guess you could say, or proven ability as a run defender at this current juncture may impact and limit his ability to see the field often early in his NFL career. And when we talk about his pass rush potential, I do think, though, on the flip side of that, when you compare him to the other rookie pass rushers, Ruka Roro, Braylon Trice, and Zion Logue, I think Dorles has the most upside as a pass rusher. That if there's anybody, if you're asking me, to put money on each one of these guys to be that guy in 3 to 5 years, that is going to be a steady part of your 4-man pass rush, Dorles is the guy that I would bet the most money on at this point. And I think because of that, he has that potential to be kind of the heir apparent to Grady Jarrett and play in a similar role and style of football. There are flashes of things that remind me of Grady Jarrett when I watched Dorles at Oregon this past year. And I think he has similar sort of upside and potential. He's not there yet. That's going to take time to develop, but there is that sort of potential. And I think when you compare him to the other rookies, I think Rook probably has a lower floor. It's a similar ceiling as Dorles does as a pass rusher, but as a lower floor just because he's a little bit more raw than Dorles is. So I think Dorles is a little higher. His floor entering the NFL as a pass rusher is higher. I think Trice's ceiling is a little bit lower than Dorles. We'll talk about Zion Logue a little bit later this month, but as I mentioned before with Braylon Trice, that Trice is more of a pressure guy as an edge rusher. And Dorles is kind of that Goldilocks guy, right? He's got the higher floor than Rook. In terms of what his potential as a pass rusher, we talked about, that was Trice. I think Trice is likely to be, again, there's the potential that he could be, an 8 to 10 sack guy, but I think he's most likely to be maybe that 4 to 6 sack guy. And I think Dorles is similar in that regard, 4 to 6 sack guy, getting you 40 to 50 pressures each and every year. And so when you look at the sort of statistical comparison, Trice and Dorles are potentially on the same level, but because Trice is an edge rusher, like that makes you basically that type of production makes you a league average edge rusher. And that type of production as an interior defensive lineman makes you in the upper part of the league. That makes you like that's like a 7 out of 10, interior D lineman with that level of production versus that's a 5 out of 10, edge rusher. And so that's why I mean where Dorlus has a higher ceiling, if he reaches that point compared to someone like Trice, even if they're statistically they look the same on the stat sheet. So despite my excitement about Dorles's long-term potential to kind of be this Grady Jarrett heir apparent, we talked about Root kind of being the heir apparent to David Onyemata, and so it makes sense to have both of these guys as those sort of interior options that could be the long-term. And as we've mentioned many times, when it comes to drafting guys, you sort of throwing darts and hoping that they hit. As we mentioned earlier this week when we went back and looked at my draft evaluations, and only about 15% of the players drafted over the last 6 years based off my evaluation have reached their ceilings that the Falcons have drafted, and only about 40% have reached their eye levels. We'll get to ceilings and eye levels and floors and whatnot later in the episode, but all that to say is I like the idea that the Falcons are taking multiple bites at the apple, and hopefully that will lead to greater success, just because the odds aren't in one individual player's favor moving forward. But despite my excitement about Dorles's long-term potential, I'm not as convinced about his ability to have immediate success and translate, to seeing a lot of playing time right away. And I want to explain why I tend to be more skeptical of Dorles's potential impact in year one than maybe some of these other rookies as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But guys, I got to tell you that passion, drive, and patience, it is the winning formula for winning championships, and it's also what's going to keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash, baby. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. And I love hearing that, because I need to get new seatbelt covers for my car. So I'm going to head on over to eBay Motors and keep my ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. So as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, I want to plug the Locked On Sports Today, the free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you each and every day to bring you the biggest stories, can't miss analysis, news, and opinions. It's all streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So as I've mentioned before, like Brandon Dorlus in 2027, that gets me excited, right? Super excited, right? I could say something inappropriate about how excited I am about what Brandon Dorlus could be in 2027, but I'm not going to say that, right? This is a family show. But in 2024, I tend to be a little bit more skeptical of what Brandon Dorlus is going to be for the two aforementioned reasons: concerns about his ability as a run defender, as well as question marks on whether or not this is the cleanest scheme fit for what the Falcons are going to ask him to do, and whether that's the ideal role for Brandon Dorlus. When we talk about the run defense, as I mentioned, his style of play is better suited to be more of that disruptor. And the question, of course, is going to be whether or not the Falcons are going to really want their guys to do that up front. We talked a little bit about this with Cody Alexander of Match Quarters a couple of weeks ago on the pod. That sort of gap and a half sort of scheme where you kind of want guys to control a gap. Traditionally in the 3-4, you tend to see teams wanting their guys up front to be more of that hold the point of attack type of role than necessarily the sort of penetrate, into the backfield and be that disruptive play presence. The idea of being like, we're going to stop the run on the way to the quarterback. That's more the Dan Quinn style of defense. And again, there's reasons to think that we could see that under Raheem Morris, the Dan Quinn protege, but we'll just sort of have to see. But when I look at the Falcons, when I'm looking at what I'm sort of projecting the Falcons D-line rotation to be. We've talked a bunch over the last several weeks about how you're expecting David Onyemata and Grady Jarrett to be the fixtures on passing downs, right? They're the most proven pass rushers currently on the Falcons roster. And so pretty much any third down, they're going to be out there on the field. And most nickel situations, playing, upwards of 70% of the snaps. But there is real opportunity for some of these young guys, including Brandon Dorlus, and some of these other young players like Ruka Roro and Zach Harrison, to carve out a significant role in the base defense, especially on those early downs, and help keep guys like Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata fresh so that, they can put their best foot forward on those passing situations. And when I compare Dorlus to some of the other potential options the Falcons could have in that early down role, I don't know if I love him over some of those other guys, right? When we talk about, holding the point of attack, that's sort of the strength of Ruka Roro's game, which is being that guy that can occupy blocks much better. The knock on Ruka is disengaging from those blocks. But he's certainly a guy that if you looking for someone to be stout against the run, he has that skill set. Zach Harrison also has a similar skill set, or at least has the potential to show a similar skill set. We talked a lot about Zach Harrison when he entered the NFL last year, which was run defense wasn't a strength of his at Ohio State, but we saw over the course of his rookie season, especially at the end of the season, that get better. And it wasn't because he lacked the skills to be a impactful run defender. It was just for whatever reason, he just wasn't as good as his talent suggested he should have been as a run defender. And we saw that, in that final month of the season, over his final 3 games, PFF graded Zach Harrison as the best run defender among edge rushers. He had the highest run stop rate among all edges over the weeks 15 through 17 in the NFL last year, according to PFF. You throw in Taquan Graham, who's also his strength is run defense. And you can, while we expect Zion Logue, LaCale London, Eddie Goldman to probably be options more as a nose tackle than a D end in the 3-4 defense, they obviously are also, plus run defenders in terms of their skill set. Not to mention, of course, you still have Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata, who are also very good run defenders as well. And so, when I look at the prime opportunity for Brandon Dorlus to carve out immediate snaps as a rookie, as a run defender, I don't think he's far from your preferred option is basically what I'm getting at. And so, if we're looking at Dorlus as a potential to carve out opportunities early in his NFL career as a run defender, he's probably better suited, or at least has more growth potential, more of an opportunity at the edge rusher position, due to his size, being that guy that can set the edge. Obviously, for those of you that don't know, Brandon Dorlus did play a lot of edge rusher in 2022 at Oregon, primarily was more of an interior guy, both in 21 and 23. But, I think he's good enough as an edge to give you options, even though, as we mentioned before, I don't know if that's the ideal role for him, but, he's not going to be able to do a lot of the other stuff that I think you want from your edge rush group, right? Like, dropping in the coverage, what you're typically looking for, the 3-4 outside linebacker. And this is the part where people are going to bring up Michael Hoyt, the outside linebacker for the Rams, the so-called 310-pound outside linebacker. And pretty much every time, I've mentioned, joking this with the Discord, that anytime someone compares, say, a Brandon Dorlus or Zach Harrison to Michael Hoyt, as far as their potential to play edge, I die a little inside because it's such superficial analysis, right? Hoyt is 310 pounds. If he can do it, why can't Dorlus? And again, that's very superficial because, first of all, Michael Hoyt has been sub 280 for at least 2 years, if not longer, in the NFL. And not to mention, Hoyt is 10 times the athlete that Brandon Dorlus is, right? If you go back to his pro day testing 4 years ago when he was coming into the NFL in 2020 out of Brown, Hoyt at 295 pounds, his 40 time was 82nd percentile. He tested better than Aaron Donald did in a lot of areas. And for those of you that don't know, Aaron Donald was a freakish level athlete as an interior defensive lineman. And if you sort of look at Michael Hoyt's testing and look at it compared to edge rushers, looking at websites like mockdraftable.com, Hoyt's 40 time, again, at 295 pounds, was 82nd percentile. His 3-cone was 77th percentile. His short shuttle was 90th percentile. His vertical jump was 54th percentile. And again, that he tested at that way 20 pounds heavier than where he is today. And so theoretically should be even more athletic, at a lighter weight that he is now today, and you compare Dorlus as an edge rusher, just looking at his testing this past year as an edge rusher, his 48 time would be 37th percentile. His three cone would be 20th percentile. His short shuttle would be first percentile. So one of the worst short shuttles for edge rusher you'll see, in his vertical jump would be 19th percentile. And so when people are like, oh, Michael Hoyt, and whether it's Zach Harrison, whether it's Brandon Dorlus, they're not the same. I just want to make that clear. And so that's why I don't necessarily see Dorlus having any sort of long-term value as an edge rusher. He can be a part-time player, right? Again, there's a path for him to play some edge as an edge rusher, but like, I don't think he's a long-term option there. I think at edge, you do have less proven options against the run. Unlike the interior defensive line, you can argue that there's only maybe two proven run defenders at edge, and Lorenzo Carter and James Smith-Williams ahead of Dorlus. And James Smith-Williams probably isn't even guaranteed to make the roster. I think he will, but we'll see about that. So there's more potential for Dorlus to come in and carve out a role as an early down edge rusher. So he might be ahead of guys like Arnold Ebiketie and D'Angelo Malone and Braylon Trice, purely as like just setting the edge. But in terms of the other aspects of playing outside linebacker in a 3-4 scheme, dropping into coverage, AK and D'Angelo Malone and Braylon Trice to me are much further ahead than Dorlus, mostly because they just have the athleticism that even they can do all the spot dropping and all the stuff that you want to do with the simulated pressures and all that stuff and more. So all that's to say is it's hard for me to see where exactly Dorlus is going to fit in year one, in 2024. Is he going to have a significant role in the rotation? And I think that's true as a run defender. I think that's true as a pass rusher. I like him as a pass rusher, and he's probably ahead of several of the other rookies as a pass rusher, but it's not as if like he's going to steal, like, you have an option. It's 3rd and 5. Who do you want on the field? David Onyemata, Grady Jarrett, or Brandon Dorlus? Like, the answer is obvious. You're going to go with Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata. Now, of course, we know injuries do happen and could happen with those guys. That was something that was an issue last year. Could be an issue this year. And so if we do have injuries to those two veterans, I probably would say Dorlus is probably your best option, as good an option, if not your best option, as anybody else you could to replace Jarrett and Onyemata in those passing down situations. But, no one's rooting for injury. So part of me wants to sit here and say, like, the less Brandon Dorlus plays in 2024, the better the Falcons defense could potentially be, just because you're probably getting more plus value on rundowns from other players. And not to mention that probably also means that Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata are healthy and productive this year as well. So, this is kind of another way that Brandon Dorlus compares to Grady Jarrett, because you guys may recall Grady Jarrett was kind of buried on that depth chart his rookie year, playing behind Jonathan Babineau and Tyson Jackson, Paul Soliai, Rashid Hageman, and even Adrian Claiborne would kick inside on passing downs in that league. So in that year, Grady Jarrett was the 6th interior D lineman in that group. And I could see Dorlus having a sort of a similar role in that, but we did see Grady in year 2 make that jump and carve out a much more significant role as a starter. And then you saw similar jumps from year 2 to year 3 to year 3 to year 4. And then by the time we got to the end of year 4 for Grady Jarrett, he became the Grady Jarrett that we all know and love as one of the premier D tackles in the NFL. The thing that helped Grady Jarrett was he joined a Falcons team that had a bunch of veteran D tackles. And as the Falcons sort of whittled those guys out of the room over the next couple of years and went more with a youth movement, you saw Grady Jarrett carve out a bigger role. Dorlus doesn't have the same sort of situation, just because he's joining a room that does have those two veterans at the top, but he also has a bunch of other sort of young guys that are also looking to carve out a role. And so if Dorlus does make those jumps in future years and gets a bigger role than I'm expecting him to have in year 1, he's going to have to earn that opportunity with some other young guys that are also, similarly and equally as promising as he has. But he clearly has the talent to carve out that significant role. Again, I like the upside of Brandon Dorlus and where he'll be 3+ years from now. But at the same time, I'm not as convinced going into year 1 that people should be expecting that to immediately pay off. Of course, would love to be wrong. He could wind up having a great summer, and this ages poorly by the time we get to September, right? Because again, it's June, and OTAs is not really the opportunity for trench guys to really sort of showcase their abilities. But if Dorlus doesn't have that monster rookie season, basically what I'm sitting here saying is I wouldn't be so quick to write him off as maybe other people would tend to be, like, oh, why didn't Dorlus, despite all this hype in terms of his upside. It didn't play off in year one. It's like, just wait with Brandon Dorlus. But that gets us into what is going to pay off for him in terms of his NFL player comparisons. And we'll talk specific players that he compares floor, ceiling, and eye level to. And of course, we'll see what former Falcon I try to, fit into this conversation. And will that be Grady Jarrett, or will that be some other interior D lineman? And we'll do that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So as we often do here on these episodes talking about the draft class, we do these NFL player comparisons. We look at the floor, which is what I think a player is year one, week one, what I think he can do for a team immediately in the NFL. His ceiling is, to me, what his max potential will wind up being. And as I mentioned earlier, over the last 6 years since I've been doing this on a semi-regular basis, only about 15% of the Falcons draft picks have reached their ceilings based off my projection, and only really one or two, Foye Oluokun and Russell Gage, have exceeded their ceilings in that period of time, as we discussed earlier this week, looking back at my projections on players. And then the eye level, to me, is the midpoint between the floor and the ceiling, which is the more realistic outcome. Again, 40% of players have reached their eye level over the last 6 years based off my analysis. And so it's much more likely that you'll see some development, but not always the max development. And so that illustrates the point. And so starting with the floor, I was split on two players. The former Falcon I wanted to comp him to was Marlon Davidson, both sort of that tweener type of guy that, Davidson was a college defensive end that the Falcons tried to convert into a NFL defensive tackle. But the player that I really like more as a comparison is DeMarvin Leal. Another sort of tweener type of guy that, like Dorles, is often labeled to. I typically don't like using players as young as Leal, who's only been in the league for 2 years, because he could break out this year and this comp won't age. Like, I remember comparing Quadri Olison to Gus Edwards a couple of years ago, and that didn't look great a couple of years because Gus Edwards wound up being much better than what he looked like at that point in his career. But, Davidson hasn't played a lot in the NFL, mostly due to injuries. We've discussed that before. Leal has had some injury issues, but he's been kind of buried in Pittsburgh's rotation, largely due to, playing behind better players, Cam Hayward and, Larry Ogunjobi and some of these other guys. Now, Leal did get some decent playing time in the first half of this past season, but then Cam Hayward came back healthy, and then Leal just kind of whittled away. But to me, that starting point where I make this comparison is, Leal, and at least in the first half of the season, was kind of a back-end rotational guy, can eat some snaps for better players, is a tweener a little bit, that's going to limit his snaps for similar reasons that we're talking about with Brandon Dorlus. This type of player, again, another more familiar Atlanta, is like basically what I think Dorlus' starting point coming into the league is similar to what we saw from guys like Albert Huggins and Timmy Horn last year, which is you come in, play, eat snaps, keep other guys fresh, but you're not going to see a lot of impactful plays from those guys. And that's, again, more of a back-end rotational guy. And that's kind of the floor I expect Dorlus to be. Again, if he gets opportunities on the field, I think he can perform, but I'm not as convinced he's going to come in and tear it up right away. Now, when we look at the opposite end of the spectrum, what is his ceiling? We talked about some of the interior outside guys over the last 10, 15 years. My ceiling comp is Malik Jackson. Right? That's where I think Dorlus' potential is. Again, another inside-outside player, would play D-end on early downs and kick inside as a pass rusher on passing downs. Jackson, compared to some of the other guys like Michael Bennett and Za'Darius Smith and Justin Tuck, was at the lower end in terms of production of that group of guys. And that's, to me, more likely for Dorlus in terms of his upside, because Michael Bennett and Za'Darius Smith at various points in their NFL careers have been, some of the best pass rushers in the NFL, And what's interesting about Dorlus and Za'Darius Smith is, like, there's a lot more athletic overlap with Za'Darius Smith, but I think Smith is much more of a natural, quote unquote, edge rusher in terms of how he's built and how he wins. I think Dorlus is more built like Malik Jackson, having a little bit more of that fuller frame and whatnot. Smith was like 275. Jackson was like 285 coming into the NFL. Jackson across a decade averaged about 4.2 sacks per 17 games and about 48 pressures. You compare that to Za'Darius Smith over his NFL career, averaging about 8.3 sacks per 17 games and 62 pressures. And Jackson's stat line is much more similar to what Grady Jarrett's average stat line is, which is about 4.3 sacks and 44 pressures every 17 games. And so that's why, again, the Grady Jarrett comparison comes to mind. And again, I think similar skill sets and whatnot. And you're like, why aren't you just comparing him to Grady Jarrett? Well, I think for a lot of reasons, Grady Jarrett was a much more disruptive player against the run coming out of Clemson. He got a lot more tackles for loss in college than, Dorles did. And so I think Grady Jarrett's floor as a run defender was significantly higher than Dorles's coming into the NFL. But, similarly, both guys are probably ideally 3 techs. And as I mentioned, Dorles can be the Grady heir apparent, while Rook can be the David Onyemata heir apparent. But when we get to the eye level, that sort of midpoint and the more realistic projection, mine is DeMarcus Walker, another sort of tweener coming into the NFL, played at Florida State, very similar athletically to Dorles. Walker got drafted by Denver back in 2017 and played in a 3-4 defense, but had a hard time finding the field under Vance Joseph and Vic Fangio. And his NFL career really didn't take off until he left Denver in year 5, signed with Houston, played more as a defensive end in Lovie Smith's 4-3 defense. Still continued to play that inside outside role, D end on early downs, would kick inside as a pass rusher on third downs. That would continue in Tennessee in 2022. And then this past year in Chicago as a starter. And he's a capable starter, but not really sort of a fixture. And, the last couple of years, Tennessee has tried to upgrade and did successfully upgrade, that spot when Walker left. And then Chicago tried to upgrade that this past offseason, but this didn't get the opportunity. And ideally, a DeMarcus Walker, similar to Brooks Reed when we were talking about Braylon Trice, is probably ideally more the 5 or 6 guy in an 8-man rotation rather than being one of the top 4 guys. And another point of comparison between Dorles and Walker is Walker has traditionally been more of an average to below average run defender as well. And so that's another point of comparison with Dorles. A similar player in Atlanta, again, using a pass Falcon, is Derek Shelby. Shelby, again, I think was better as a run defender than Dorles is, and probably a more natural edge rusher, while I think Dorles is more natural interior guy. And so that's part of the reason why I didn't make that comparison. But another reason for the Walker comp is the questions about the scheme fit, right? Walker didn't really blossom in the NFL until he got into a 4-3. And I wonder, will we see a similar thing with Dorles? Is he an ideal fit in a 3-4? And you've heard me talk a lot in the past about, the superficial differences between a 3-4 and a 4-3. The schemes aren't dramatically different, because teams are using hybrid fronts and sort of taking elements from both schemes and incorporating them into sort of hybrid defenses. The big superficial differences in a 3-4, your edge rushers stand up. In a 4-3, your edge rushers put their hand in the dirt. But just because the schemes aren't drastically different doesn't mean that players don't drastically fit one versus the other, right? We're talking about the scheme, not necessarily the individual components that make up, the defense or whatnot. The blueprint might be very similar and printed on the same paper, but, the things that you actually have to build the building out of or whatever you're trying to construct, wood versus iron versus concrete, etc. That's kind of what we're talking about. What it means is basically like, you have examples of players that can be better in a 2-point stance than in a 3-point stance, right? Daniel Hunter, that was a player that when I was doing my research last year, talking about the potential trade for Daniel Hunter, that was a lot of talk in Minnesota the previous year of when they switched to a 3-4, was Daniel Hunter as effective a pass rusher? He still was very productive, regardless, and talent supersedes scheme in that regard. But people thought he was a better fit as a D end in a 4-man front than he was as a outside linebacker in a 3-man front. And that may be also a factor in why Daniel Hunter chose to sign with Houston over Atlanta, if you believe in the rumors that, the Falcons, offered him a similar contract because Houston plays a 4-3 defense and Atlanta plays a 3-4 defense. So again, I think Dorles probably is a better fit as an edge rusher in a 4-3 than he is in a 3-4. Again, I think he's probably a better fit as an interior rusher in a 4-3 than he would be in a 3-4, due to his pass rush billing being better suited for that. As we mentioned before, like his earlier testing numbers, while as an edge rusher would be 20th percentile on average, he's more like a 70th percentile athlete when it comes to taking all those metrics and applying them to interior defensive linemen. So I think, again, better disruptive presence against the run, better as a penetrator, and typically in a 4-3 defense, you're more likely to incline schemes that are asking, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to stop the run on the way to the quarterback, be more of that attacking defense that typically fits more you see more 4-3 teams doing that than 3-4 teams doing that. So, again, love Dorles' upside, just not 100% convinced at this point in time that it's going to pay off here in Atlanta. And that's kind of a through line of this entire draft class where, you guys know me, I'm a believer when I see it type of thing. And just because we haven't seen it, that's part of the reason why it may be harder for me to buy in automatically than some of you other guys. We got a first year coaching staff. And so 6 months from now, we'll be like, oh, I see how this works. And now it makes a lot more sense. But until we get to that point, there will be a healthier skepticism in me. But again, love the potential of Brandon Dorlus, but we'll just sort of have to see how it all translates, year one, how it all translates from a scheme standpoint. So time will tell on that issue, but that's going to do it for us here on today's episode. Next week, we'll talk more about JD Bertram. We should be able to get to that by the end of next week. We'll talk probably about Bijan's potential upside in this offense a little bit more. We'll talk maybe about some of these UFL signings. I might be behind on my film watching, but the Locked On Falcons insiders, or at least I might be behind on the podcast end of my film watching, but the Locked On Falcons insiders are, right up to speed, because as I'm talking, there's probably a Casey Washington film breakdown coming their way. And if you want to become a Locked On Falcons insider, hit that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/Locked On Falcons, and you can get access to all of the film breakdowns I do of these draft classes and be potentially 2 weeks ahead of everybody else, just as humbly waiting on the pod. And of course, you get a 14-day free trial. So you'll probably get these last two ones in Casey Washington and Zion Logue for free over the next 14 days. And then we'll break into some more NFL film now after we're done with the college stuff. And so you can get access to that. And then, 14-day free trial, $4.99 a month after that point. So you can figure out over the next 14 days if you think it's worth your while. But that's going to do it for us, guys. Continue to make us your first listen by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, all the other shows here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Have a great weekend, everyone.